One day, someone knocked on our door and Mom opened it. "Ma'am, please hurry up. Your daughter got into a fight with 3 girls and they're hurt very badly." Mom ran really fast to the store where she saw everything was a mess, like a tornado had swept through. "Maggie! Maggie, where are you?" Just then, she saw 3 huge men holding a teenage girl kicking and screaming. They were trying to calm her down, but it wasn't working. But when the girl saw her mom, she ran to hug her. "Ma'am, she attacked 3 girls. I think they're her classmates. The girls were taken to the hospital. One of them is in serious condition." "Mom, don't listen to him. I'm your good girl." And the girl they were talking about is me. I hugged Mom again and held on to her as I pulled a switchblade out of my pocket, aimed it at a rice bag, and hit it at the perfect angle to tip it over. The bag fell on the man's head, and he collapsed. Mom turned around as he fell to the ground. "Oh dear, that poor man." "Don't worry, Mom. He just got tired from standing up all day." Then Mom gave me the strangest look. "Who are you, young lady?" "I'm your only child, your husband went missing, and you have no one. It's only me. Don't worry if you're not understanding what's going on. I'll explain it to you later. Let's pray those girls are dead by now." No. The girls are dead? No, not dead. I meant bed. I hope they're in bed by now, resting. They're fine, I swear. Then Mom burst into tears. I tried everything to calm her down, but she wouldn't stop crying. I slipped the big security guard a $100 bill and asked if he could give us a ride home. We walked out of the store, and then I realized we were surrounded by the bad guys. Yep, this mission was a disaster. I'm Maggie, and let's just say I have a special set of skills. But before I continue, please like and subscribe. Before I met Mom, I lived in an orphanage in a small town. I was pretty quiet and kept to myself, but I loved playing in the sandbox. I could build anything if I saw a picture of it first. I built sandcastles, sand rockets, sand airplanes, and I even sculpted my favorite teacher. My sand sculptures were so cool, they got lots of attention. The newspaper even came to take my picture once. One day when I was 9, I'd been making a complicated new sandcastle for hours when 3 of the biggest bullies walked up to me. "Your stupid sandcastle is in my way, weirdo. Move it or else." "There's plenty of room and I can't move it, dummy. Plus, I was here first." The bully got really mad, then he and his friends smashed my sandcastle to pieces. "Tell anyone and we'll smash your face too." I cried like a baby, and I even told the nuns in the orphanage, but the bullies just denied it. That night, I watched a martial arts movie about a man that fought a dozen bad guys and beat them to a pulp. The next morning, as I was building another castle, the bullies came up to me and tried to push me around, but then I thought about the martial arts movie, and I suddenly started kicking and punching like a ninja. I gave 2 of the bullies a black eye and punched the big one in the nose. They ran off crying to the nuns. "She's a maniac. She's out of control." The nuns didn't even listen to my side of the story and grounded me for a month. I was so angry I could scream. Then the best thing happened. This strange couple, we'll call them Mr. and Mrs. X, adopted me. They flew me to America on a private jet and moved me into a huge mansion. But when I walked through the doors, I learned that Mr. and Mrs. X had adopted another girl my age named Grace. And that wasn't even the craziest part. During the day, Mr. and Mrs. X worked as executives at a huge security company to pay the bills. But at night, they were vigilantes fighting for justice. Grace and I started training for the secret family business on our very first day. Grace also had a special set of skills like me. Before she met Mr. and Mrs. X, she lived with a magician, so she knew a ton of magic tricks, and she could appear and disappear with the snap of a finger. Yeah, it was kinda creepy. Mr. and Mrs. X played us a couple scenes from a boxing movie on TV, then threw us into a boxing ring. I didn't want to hurt Grace. She seemed really sweet. Do we have to fight each other? Whoever wins gets $500. And the biggest room. The next thing I knew, Grace's fist came flying at my face, and I landed flat on my back. "Hey, that's cheating. I wasn't ready." "Too bad, loser. Are you gonna cry or get up and fight?" Then Grace kicked me. I jumped to my feet, and we fought like a couple of wild dogs. I used my ninja skills to pin her to the ground. After that, Grace and I spent our days learning new skills, like picking locks, driving getaway cars, and swinging from tall buildings. By the time we were 15, every night, Mr. and Mrs. X took us out on missions where we beat up criminals, tied them up, and drop them off in front of the police station. Mr. X was really nice, and even when we weren't fighting crime, he loved spending time with me. But I always felt like I wasn't Mrs. X's favorite. Whenever I tried to talk to Mrs. X, she'd get bored and start asking about Grace. Mrs. X and Grace even left the house late at night to go on special training missions and refused to let me join them. Sorry, Maggie, there's only room for 2. I felt so left out, and it made me pretty sad. But then, I met my best friend Asher. He lived in the house next door, and he always made me smile. We'd play video games, watch MSA videos, and build model airplanes. One time, Asher almost figured out my secret. Why is your watch beeping like that? Maggot, we need you ASAP! The bad guys are— Ah! Was that Grace? Is she okay? Oh, that's nothing. It's just a little game we play sometimes. Actually, I have to go. See ya! I really liked Asher. He was a great friend, but I felt so guilty lying to him all the time. Grace knew I had a crush on Asher, so she loved torturing him. Once he came over to visit me, and she pretended to be sick. Oh no, I don't feel so good. Asher ran over to help her. What's wrong? Is there anything I can do? Then she pulled out a water gun, sprayed him in the face, and then shoved him out the door. Sucker! Grace hung out with the popular kids, who she'd turned into her little minions. She loved to brag about how she had more friends, more boyfriends, and better clothes than me. But when Grace and I were in high school, things took a turn. Mr. and Mrs. X lost their jobs at the security company, and money got really tight. Then one night, I caught Mrs. X and Grace stealing a bag of money from a crew of bank robbers instead of turning the money into the police. A couple hours later, reports of the missing money were all over the news. I told Mr. X what Grace and Mrs. X did, and it caused the biggest fight. We're the good guys. You have to give that money back. They'll never know it was us. Plus, I need new shoes. My disguise is too small, and our gadgets are way too old. But stealing is wrong. So is your stupid face. If you don't give it back, then I will. Mrs. X promised to give back the money, but the next morning, I woke up to a crashing sound. Then the police stormed through the doors. Mrs. X was gone, and she'd taken all the criminals' money and cleaned out all our bank accounts. The police told us that Mrs. X had been stealing from criminals and banks across the city for years and had framed Mr. X for the crimes. Mr. X and I were shocked and heartbroken, but I could tell Grace already knew. Of course she did. Later, I tried to talk to Grace. I know you were in on it. You and Mrs. X were so close, and you lied about your secret missions. Why did you two do this? Because we wanted a great life for ourselves away from you two. We had bigger ambitions, and now it's all ruined and I'm stuck with you. But I know she'll come back for me, because she loves me. She never cared much for you. But so much time passed, and Mrs. X never came back or responded to any of our attempts to reach her, and Grace grew bitter and angrier by the day. Asher and I tried to cheer her up. One morning, we made her favorite chocolate waffles. Look, Grace, we made your favorite breakfast. Are you and your idiot friend trying to poison me, you backstabbing jerk? Grace threw a waffle at me and dumped orange juice on Asher's head. My eyes! Then Grace tried to drown me with syrup. Dad rushed in to break it up. Luckily, Asher wasn't hurt too bad, and Grace was grounded for a month. When Grace and I turned 17, Mr. X fell in love with a rich woman named Miss Cherry. Now, when I say rich, I mean really rich. Like she owned 3 mansions, donated millions of dollars to charities, and even had a hospital named after her. And Grace hated Miss Cherry. She slammed doors in her face, gave her dirty looks, and refused to talk to her. I thought Miss Cherry was really nice though. Even though she was so wealthy, she was sweet and down to earth. We spent hours talking, and she loved helping me with my homework, and she even taught me how to play the piano. For the first time, I felt like I really had a mom. Soon, Miss Cherry and Mr. X got married. Mr. X was called away for a job interview out of the city, and while he was gone for a few days, Grace started acting really weird. She'd sneak out of the house late at night, and when I asked her where she was going, she'd snap at me. Mind your own business, loser. One night, Miss Cherry was cooking, and she accidentally spilled a cup of water. Then she slipped on the water and hit her head hard on the floor. I ran over to help her up, and thankfully, she was conscious soon. But then she started to panic because she didn't even know where she was or who I was. Heck, she didn't even remember her own name. I told her I was Maggie and I was her daughter. I told her to rest while I got her medicine for her throbbing head from the store. As I entered the store, I got an alert on my phone. It was a message from Mr. X. Maggie, listen, I don't have much time. Miss Cherry is in danger. Mrs. X and Grace are going to try to steal all her money. You have to protect her. The video cut off, and just then, I turned to see Grace and her minions behind me. It's over, Maggie. You're outnumbered. Fighting is futile. Mrs. X and I will get Miss Cherry and all her money. You'll have to get through me first. Grace and her minions charged at me, holding breadsticks like swords. We fought in all the aisles, knocking over a dozen displays, and food flew everywhere. By the time we were finished, the grocery store was destroyed. 2 burly security guards grabbed me and pulled me off Grace and her friends. Then out of nowhere, Miss Cherry appeared. Maggie! Maggie, where are you? So, this brings us back to the beginning. Miss Cherry took one look at me and the mess and got really confused and then upset, and I was trying to take her home, but now we were surrounded by the bad guys, Grace and her evil minions. Yeah, she'd called in backup, and there were more of them now. Grace had a big bruise on her forehead, her hair was all messed up, and she looked like a crazy lunatic. Miss Cherry, took one look at the girls and started yelling at me. Maggie, you terrible girl! Look at what you've done! Apologize at once! Then the big security guard pulled off his mask, and it was Mrs. X in disguise. Give us Miss Cherry. We just need to take her for a few hours, have her sign over her wealth to us, and then we'll return her to you to live together happily ever after. There was no way I was going to hand poor Miss Cherry to Mrs. X and Grace, so there was only one thing I could do. Run! I jumped in the air, flipped over their heads, and grabbed a bunch of apple pies off a food cart. One by one at supersonic speed, I hit Grace, Mrs. X, and the minions in the face. They fell down in a daze, and I grabbed Miss Cherry, pulled her into a random car, and drove her straight home. We were almost home when I saw Mrs. X and Grace on my tail in a huge moving van. We had a high-speed chase through the streets. I turned a corner and swerved toward my house and almost hit Asher. Mrs. X and Grace came barreling down the road. I grabbed Asher and Miss Cherry, ran inside the house, and barricaded the doors. Miss Cherry sat down on the couch and took a nap. What's going on? When did you learn to drive? Before I could explain, Mrs. X and Grace jumped through the window. Surrender, you big loser! We won! Asher got so scared he dropped his milkshake on the floor. Grace lunged at me, slipped on Asher's milkshake, and lost her balance. I grabbed her, shoved her into a closet, and locked the door. Then Mrs. X grabbed Asher. Give me the old lady, or your little friend here is toast. Asher screamed like a banshee and fainted in Mrs. X's arms. Then Miss Cherry appeared out of nowhere. She hit Mrs. X in the head with a vase and knocked her out. Look, I stopped the bad woman. I'm hungry. Who wants ice cream? Mr. X and the police arrived later and took Grace and Mrs. X off to jail. Mr. X had been captured by one of Mrs. X's associates and tied to a tree on the side of the road, but he cut his way out and ran all the way home. Asher didn't speak to me for weeks after the incident, but I convinced him to meet me on the roof at school. I can't believe you lied to me all these years. I wanted to protect you. I'd never be able to forgive myself if I ever put you in danger. You're my best friend, and so much more. What do you mean, more? A lot more. I like you, dummy. Asher leaned in for a kiss. I couldn't help but giggle. I was so nervous. What's so funny? I've never kissed a boy before. I've never met a real-life vigilante. Then this should be fun. Put on this mask and hold on tight. I'm taking you for a ride.